Before the image there is only black. Then comes static. A pause long enough to make the silence feel dangerous. Then, in that unmistakable gravelly voice, Liam Neeson delivers the speech that permanently changed the way audiences heard him. The words are simple. The threat isn't. What made the moment so powerful was not just what Neeson said but who was saying it. In 2008, Liam Neeson was hardly an obvious action hero. He was an Oscar-nominated dramatic actor whose reputation had been built on weight, restraint. He was the haunted Oscar Schindler of Schindler's List, the conflicted intellectual of Kinsey, an actor audiences associated with history, tragedy, prestige, and emotional gravity. And then Taken arrived. Suddenly, that same voice belonged to a father who could dismantle an international criminal operation with terrifying efficiency. He was 55 years old, not the man who would kick down a door, break a wrist, and calmly explain what was going to happen next. That contradiction was the secret. Neeson did not look like the action stars who had dominated the previous generation. He was not 25, impossibly muscular, or built around athletic spectacle. He looked older, more tired, more human, and somehow that made him more dangerous. Brian Mills was not introduced as a superhero. He was a father who had spent years preparing for a world he hoped he would never have to enter. When his daughter is kidnapped in Paris, that preparation becomes a weapon. His age becomes part of the fantasy. Every movement feels deliberate. Every threat sounds final. The audience is not watching a young man discover he can fight. They are watching an experienced man reveal what he has been capable of all along. Taken was sold like a lean, disposable B-movie, but its impact reached far beyond its budget. It arrived when the mid-budget action thriller was struggling to find a place in Hollywood. Spectacle was getting bigger, franchises were getting louder, and studios wanted bigger properties. Taken suggested another possibility. What if the star did not need to be younger, the world did not need to be enormous, and the story did not need to be complicated? What if all you needed was a compelling threat, a clear objective, and an actor audiences believed? That formula became a blueprint. Years before Hollywood filled theaters with aging action heroes, Taken gave the trend a shape audiences could feel: Jerry action. The aging badass became a selling point. Liam Neeson became the face of it. Taken did more than save a fictional daughter. It helped rescue an entire kind of movie. The compact adult action thriller that could live on urgency instead of spectacle. When that voice cuts through static, it is bigger than a threat. It is the sound of Hollywood discovering that its next action hero had been standing in front of the camera for decades. He just needed a movie to let him become lethal. Section 1.2, Video Roadmap. This is not simply a story about a father hunting for his kidnapped daughter. It is how a 93-minute movie became a machine. Lean, direct, efficient, and influential. To understand that, we have to pull Taken apart. First, we go behind the camera and into the unusual production system that helped shape it. Luc Besson's EuropaCorp was built around a philosophy: make international genre films quickly, control budgets, cross borders, and build entertainment around simple concepts that travel. Taken looks like a Hollywood action movie, but its DNA comes from a different production culture. Then we examine the screenplay itself. There is almost no wasted motion. The story establishes Brian Mills, gives him a personal vulnerability, creates the kidnapping, and turns that wound into a ticking clock. Every major sequence pushes the same objective forward. Instead of piling on subplots, Taken keeps narrowing the tunnel until there is only one direction left: find Kim. From there we look at Brian himself. What makes him frightening is not simply his combat ability. It is the contrast between his awkward attempts to reconnect with his daughter and the terrifying competence hidden underneath. The movie turns parental anxiety into an action fantasy. We will also break down the action. Taken is not built around elaborate set pieces for their own sake. Its violence is often brief, functional, and brutally readable. The choreography communicates character. Brian fights to finish the problem. But the film becomes more complicated when we examine what sits underneath that efficiency. Its vision of Paris, European institutions, corruption, tourism, and human trafficking is deeply exaggerated and politically uncomfortable. The movie transforms Paris into a nightmare maze where danger seems to exist around every corner. That fantasy makes the story immediate, but it also creates assumptions about Europe and trafficking that deserve scrutiny. Finally, we reach the legacy. Taken did not simply succeed. It helped establish a new Hollywood archetype. The older man whose age is not an obstacle, but part of his appeal. So this is not just a recap. It is an autopsy of why it works. We are going to examine the production machine, narrative architecture, psychology, violence, controversies, and cultural aftershock of Taken, and discover how a deceptively simple revenge thriller became one of the most influential action movies of its era. That simplicity makes the movie tough to dismiss. Taken begins with an idea that sounds almost too simple to become a phenomenon. Take a familiar action premise, strip away everything unnecessary, put it in an international setting, and give the lead actor a skill set audiences can understand instantly. But behind that simplicity was Luc Besson's remarkably efficient European production machine. Through EuropaCorp, Besson had developed a model that operated differently from the traditional Hollywood system. Instead of waiting for enormous budgets and major studio machinery, the company specialized in high-concept genre movies that could be produced relatively cheaply, filmed internationally, and presented in English for a global audience. The goal was not to reinvent action cinema every time. It was to identify a powerful premise and execute it with speed. Taken fit that philosophy almost perfectly. At the center of the production was Pierre Morel, a filmmaker whose background initially seemed more suited to images than to blockbuster storytelling. Morel had worked as a cinematographer, including on District B13, and that experience mattered. He understood movement, framing, spatial geography, and the physical texture of action. His camera could make environments feel immediate without turning every fight into visual chaos. That approach would become essential to Taken. The movie needed to feel fast, but it could not become confusing. Brian Mills had to appear extraordinarily capable while the audience always understood what he was doing, where he was going, and why each action mattered. Morel's visual instincts helped create that balance. The film's Paris is not presented as a postcard. It becomes a functional maze of apartments, streets, clubs, hotels, warehouses, and back rooms. The locations exist less as tourist attractions than as obstacles Brian must penetrate. And then there was Liam Neeson. Today, casting Neeson as Brian Mills seems almost inevitable. In retrospect, it is difficult to imagine anyone else giving the character that combination of physical intimidation, sadness, and authority. But Neeson did not initially see the role that way. He was already an established dramatic actor, and Taken was not the kind of project that naturally fit the image he had built over decades. His expectations were reportedly modest. He understood the movie as a relatively small production and even believed it might eventually go straight to video. His motivation was not to launch an action franchise or reinvent himself as a movie star. He simply wanted to work. There was another attraction to Paris. Neeson was interested in spending time in the city, and the production gave him an opportunity to do exactly that. But once he accepted the role, something unexpected happened. The physical demands became real. Brian Mills is not supposed to look like a superhero. He is supposed to look like someone who has spent his life learning how dangerous people operate. So Neeson trained in hand-to-hand combat and prepared for the physicality required by the role. The goal was not to transform him into a young martial arts star. It was to make his movements believable for a highly trained older operative. That distinction became one of the movie's greatest strengths. Neeson moves differently from a conventional action hero. There is weight behind him. His body does not appear effortless. When Brian attacks someone, the action feels like a trained professional using experience rather than athletic showmanship. That physical realism was especially important because the screenplay was designed around efficiency. Besson and Robert Mark Kamen did not construct Taken as a sprawling thriller filled with competing storylines. The script is almost aggressively focused. Brian wants one thing, his daughter back. Everything else is secondary. His relationship with Kim establishes the emotional stakes. Her trip to Paris creates the vulnerability. The kidnapping creates the objective. The phone call creates the ticking clock. From that point forward, the story keeps pushing Brian toward the next piece of information. There is remarkably little narrative fat. A traditional thriller might pause for extended investigations, romantic subplots, secondary characters, or elaborate explanations. Taken keeps cutting those possibilities away. Brian does not need to debate what he should do. He already knows. That creates the film's central propulsion. Every scene either gives Brian information, puts an obstacle in his way, or shows him overcoming that obstacle. The movie rarely allows the audience to forget the objective because the objective is the story. And that was precisely why the production could remain relatively lean. The filmmakers were not trying to create an enormous world. They were creating a pressure cooker. The genius of the concept was that Brian's professional background could solve narrative problems instantly. Instead of spending 20 minutes establishing why he can investigate a crime, the script tells us he possesses a particular set of skills. Instead of making his competence a mystery, it makes competence the premise. That decision transformed exposition into momentum. Taken therefore emerged from an unusual combination. Besson's European action production philosophy, Morel's visual discipline, Neeson's unexpected physical transformation, and a screenplay engineered around ruthless narrative economy. Nobody involved needed to believe they were creating a cultural landmark. They only needed the next scene to work. And because almost every scene does exactly that, the movie moves with a confidence that makes its modest origins easy to forget. To understand why Taken felt so different, you have to understand what action cinema looked like before Brian Mills walked into Paris. In 2008, the genre was changing rapidly. The old action hero was disappearing. For years, audiences had been trained to associate action movies with enormous physiques, explosive one-liners, and stars who seemed almost indestructible. Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Bruce Willis had defined different versions of that tradition, but Hollywood was moving toward something else. The superhero era was beginning to accelerate. Iron Man had just arrived and demonstrated how effectively modern technology, recognizable characters, and enormous studio resources could create a new kind of blockbuster. Action was increasingly being absorbed into franchise filmmaking, where computer-generated spectacle could produce armies, machines, collapsing buildings, and worlds that would have been impossible to stage physically a generation earlier. At the same time, another trend was reshaping the way action looked. The Bourne Ultimatum had popularized a frantic visual language built around handheld cameras, rapid editing, and disorienting movement. The objective was to make audiences feel as if they were inside the violence rather than watching it from a safe distance. But there was a downside. When everyone copied the style, intensity could become confusion. Action movies increasingly competed by becoming bigger, faster, louder, and more visually aggressive. Yet Taken arrived with almost the opposite philosophy. It was smaller, it was simpler, and its star was 55. That combination should have been a disadvantage. Instead, it became the movie's identity. Liam Neeson was not entering Taken with the cultural position of a traditional action superstar. His reputation was rooted primarily in serious drama. Audiences knew his voice, his presence, his ability to communicate authority, but they were not necessarily expecting him to become a one-man assault team. That disconnect was important because Brian Mills did not need to compete with superheroes. He needed to feel believable enough for the premise. The film was also operating under relatively modest expectations. Taken was released in France in early 2008 before eventually reaching American audiences in January 2009, a period that had long carried an unfortunate reputation in Hollywood. January was often treated as a dumping ground, a place where studios could release movies they did not expect to become major cultural events. Taken seemed to fit that assumption. It was an English-language action movie from a French production company. Its lead was a respected dramatic actor rather than an established action icon. Its premise was straightforward, its budget was comparatively restrained, and it did not arrive surrounded by the enormous promotional machinery of a superhero franchise. There was little reason to expect it to become the defining action film of its moment. Then people saw the trailer. The marketing understood something fundamental. The movie did not need to explain itself. The premise could be communicated in seconds. A daughter is kidnapped. Her father answers the phone. He makes a promise. And suddenly the entire movie is contained inside that promise. The trailer's most powerful weapon was Neeson's voice. That voice carried an authority that the visuals did not need to manufacture. Deep, controlled, and almost emotionless, it made Brian sound less like a desperate father and more like someone announcing an unavoidable outcome. The famous phone conversation became the centerpiece. Instead of selling audiences on expensive spectacle, the marketing sold them on certainty. He would find them, he would hunt them, and they would regret taking his daughter. That simplicity created curiosity because it turned the movie into a question audiences immediately understood. What happens when the wrong people kidnap the daughter of the wrong man? The trailer did not need to reveal every action sequence. It did not need elaborate mythology. It simply presented the threat and then presented the man capable of answering it. That was enough. Word began spreading because the concept was incredibly easy to communicate. You could explain Taken to someone in one sentence and they would understand why they might want to see it. It was also perfectly suited to an era increasingly driven by word of mouth, online discussion, clips, and repeat viewing. The movie's premise was instantly shareable, and Neeson's transformation gave people something unexpected to talk about. The aging dramatic actor was suddenly terrifying. The modest French thriller suddenly looked like an action movie with teeth. And the January release that could have buried Taken instead became part of its mythology. The film entered the marketplace without looking like a revolution. It looked like a small movie with a very big hook. But underneath that hook was something Hollywood had temporarily forgotten how powerful it could be. Clarity. Taken did not ask audiences to keep track of a complicated mythology or understand a dozen competing motivations. It told them exactly what mattered, gave them a protagonist they could instantly understand, and promised that the story would deliver on its central threat. In a cinematic landscape obsessed with scale, Taken was selling intensity, and that difference was about to become impossible to ignore. Taken begins by doing something almost cruel to its hero. It makes Brian Mills look small. Before he becomes the unstoppable force of the film, Brian is introduced as a man who has already lost the most important role in his life. He is a retired government operative, highly trained and capable, but emotionally stranded. His daughter Kim is growing up without him, and Brian tries to compensate with gifts, favors, and nervous attention. The clearest symbol is almost absurdly ordinary: a karaoke machine. Brian brings Kim an oversized karaoke setup, hoping that an extravagant present can somehow purchase a place in the life of a daughter who would rather be anywhere than sitting through another awkward moment with her father. The gesture is sincere, but it reveals his weakness. He understands protection better than connection. The movie deliberately refuses to introduce him as a traditional action hero. There is no immediate display of combat ability, no spectacular mission, no warehouse full of weapons. Instead, we meet a lonely man living in a stark apartment, surrounded by the emptiness of a life stripped down after retirement. Then we see where his daughter lives. Lenore's world is different. Her home with Stuart is expansive, polished, comfortable. Brian's apartment feels like a temporary holding space. Lenore's mansion feels like the life Kim has already begun to inherit. Brian is not simply competing with an ex-husband. He is competing with an entire lifestyle. Stuart can provide the things Brian cannot. He has money, status, space, and the effortless confidence of someone who does not need to ask permission to belong. Brian arrives carrying gifts and hoping his daughter will choose to spend time with him. That makes him appear pathetic before the movie ever allows him to appear powerful. And that is exactly the point. His professional competence is almost hidden beneath personal failure. He can read a room, anticipate threats, and react under pressure. Yet he struggles with a simple dinner conversation. He is a man out of time. His old profession depended on secrecy, vigilance, and emotional control. His new life demands openness, patience, and trust. Brian is better suited to a dangerous world than to a peaceful one. Retirement has not made him free. It has made him irrelevant. Kim is the one person who can make him feel relevant again. But Kim is also becoming independent. When she tells Brian that she wants to travel to Paris with Amanda, his reaction reveals the central conflict before the kidnapping ever occurs. To Kim, Paris represents freedom and the chance to prove she is old enough to make decisions without her father. To Brian, the same trip represents exposure. He knows what can happen when a young person enters an unfamiliar environment without understanding the risks. His fear is not completely irrational. The movie gives him enough professional knowledge to make his anxiety feel almost prophetic. But there is a problem. Brian's knowledge has become paranoia. He sees threats where Kim sees possibility. His questions feel like interrogation to her. This establishes Taken's emotional engine. Brian believes protection is love. Kim experiences protection as control. Neither perspective is completely false. Brian has spent years seeing the worst possibilities. Kim is young enough to believe they happen to other people. That clash reaches its crucial moment when Kim needs permission to travel. The travel document is more than paperwork. It is the hinge on which the entire movie turns. Brian hesitates because signing it means accepting something he cannot control. Once Kim leaves the country, he cannot simply drive across town if something goes wrong. He has to trust the world, trust Kim, and trust that nothing will happen. For a man whose identity was built around preventing exactly that kind of uncertainty, the decision is agonizing. Eventually, he signs. It looks like a small gesture. It is actually the inciting incident. The signature gives Kim the freedom she wants, but it also opens the door to the nightmare Brian has been imagining. He warned her. Yet he cannot protect her from a world he already knows is dangerous. The first act therefore performs a clever reversal. It begins by making Brian look weak, because he cannot control his relationship with his daughter. Then, almost imperceptibly, it shows us that his weakness is attached to an enormous reservoir of capability. The karaoke machine, the empty apartment, the mansion, the travel permission, the anxious questions. All prepare the same contradiction. Brian desperately wants to be an ordinary father. But the movie is about to remind him that he was never ordinary. And once Kim disappears, that buried identity will stop being a source of frustration and become the only thing standing between her and the people who took her. The permission slip transforms their family disagreement into a countdown. The permission slip has been signed, the argument is over, and Brian's worst instincts appear to have been proven wrong. Kim and Amanda arrive in Paris expecting the kind of freedom that feels harmless when you are young. New city, new friends, late nights, and stories they can bring home. But Taken wastes almost no time reminding us that freedom and vulnerability can occupy the same space. At the airport, the girls meet Peter, a charming stranger who seems almost too convenient. He is friendly, confident, and immediately interested in helping them navigate an unfamiliar city. Nothing about the encounter initially looks like a threat. The film understands that danger rarely introduces itself as danger. Peter represents the kind of person Kim is prepared to trust, because he appears to belong to the world she wants to enter. Brian, meanwhile, has spent the opening act warning her about strangers and the possibility that people may not have good intentions. Now the audience gets to see the nightmare behind his warnings. At the apartment, the film begins tightening the space around them. What looked like an exciting trip suddenly becomes a trap. The camera turns an ordinary bedroom into a defensive position, and Kim's vulnerability becomes physical. The kidnapping sequence works because it is not staged like a conventional action scene. There is no heroic interruption, no convenient escape. Brian is not there. Kim is, and she is hiding. The geometry of the scene is brutally simple. Kim is underneath a bed, reduced to almost nothing, while Amanda is exposed in the room above her. From that position, Kim can see what is happening without being able to stop it. The audience shares her limited perspective. Amanda is taken. Kim watches. And for a few seconds, the movie forces us to experience helplessness rather than action. Taken is ultimately a fantasy about reversing helplessness. Brian's entire journey will be built around undoing this moment. But first, the film makes the audience sit inside it. Kim reaches for the phone. Brian answers. And suddenly, the movie changes genres. The conversation begins like a desperate family call. Brian hears the fear in his daughter's voice, and his first instinct is emotional. He wants to know what happened and whether she is safe. Then the professional inside him takes control. This transition is one of the most important character moments in the entire film. Brian does not magically stop being a father. He becomes more frightening because he remains one. His love for Kim is now being filtered through years of training. Panic is converted into procedure. He tells her to stay calm. He tells her what to do. He asks for information. What do they look like? How many are there? What can she hear? Where are they taking Amanda? Every question has a purpose. This is the first time the audience sees Brian operate in the world he understands. His awkward attempts to be a normal father suddenly feel like the disguise. This is the real Brian. And Kim begins describing the kidnappers. The scene reverses the traditional rescue narrative. Usually, the hero gathers information after the crime. Here, the victim becomes the hero's eyes while the crime is still happening. Brian knows that every second matters. He also knows that he cannot physically reach her. That is what makes the phone call unbearable. He can hear his daughter being taken, but he cannot touch the situation. Then comes the moment that transforms the movie. Brian hears the voice of one of the men on the phone. Marco. The voice is cold, detached, almost bored. Brian has reached someone who has done this before. He knows exactly what that means. Brian understands the situation immediately. His daughter has been taken. The men have identified themselves. And now the only weapon he has is the certainty of what he is capable of doing next. He gives the warning. The famous promise is not shouted. Brian speaks with the controlled calm of a man who has stopped negotiating emotionally and started calculating professionally. Marco's response is essentially dismissive. Good luck. The call ends. And with it, Brian's old life ends too. The father who spent the opening act trying to reconnect with his daughter is gone. In his place is the operative who knows exactly what kidnapping means, exactly how little time he has, and exactly what kind of people he is hunting. The brilliance of the sequence is that the action has barely begun, yet the movie already feels irreversible. Brian has no army, no jurisdiction, and no guarantee that Kim is alive. He has only a voice, a few fragments of information, and a promise made over a phone. But for the first time, the audience understands something Kim never fully did. Her father was not simply overprotective. He was trained for this. And the people who took her have just given him a reason to stop holding back. Once Kim disappears, Taken stops being a family drama and becomes a countdown. Brian knows the clock is already running. His former colleagues give him the brutal reality of the situation. In cases like this, the first 96 hours are critical. Every hour that passes makes the chances of finding a kidnapped victim alive increasingly uncertain. For Brian, the number is not background information. It is pressure. 96 hours turns the entire second act into a race against time. And the film uses that deadline to eliminate hesitation. Brian cannot afford to investigate slowly, wait for perfect evidence, or wonder whether he is crossing a line. Every decision has to produce the next piece of information. He arrives in Paris with one objective: find Kim. And the efficiency begins immediately. Brian returns to the airport and starts reconstructing the chain of events that led to the kidnapping. The same city that initially looked exciting and glamorous now becomes an enormous crime scene. He identifies a spotter connected to the operation and follows him. What follows is one of the clearest demonstrations of how Taken wants us to understand Brian's competence. He does not behave like an ordinary tourist trying to solve a crime. He moves through the city as though he has already accepted that every person could be useful, every location could contain information, and every delay could cost Kim her life. The pursuit eventually reaches a construction site, transforming an ordinary urban environment into a temporary battlefield. The sequence is rough rather than elegant. Brian chases, fights, and interrogates with a single-minded purpose. There is no sense that he is enjoying the violence. He simply treats resistance as another problem to be removed. That distinction matters. Taken does not build Brian as a reluctant hero who spends the movie questioning whether violence is justified. His moral line has already been established in his mind. Someone took his daughter. They are responsible. He will find them. The film's Paris therefore becomes increasingly divided. There is the Paris tourists recognize: beautiful architecture, historic streets, bright landmarks, cafes, and romantic imagery. Then there is Brian's Paris. His version is hidden beneath the postcard. It is cramped apartments, dirty streets, corrupt networks, drug dealers, traffickers, criminals, and anonymous rooms where vulnerable people disappear. The movie deliberately moves Brian away from the glamorous surface and deeper into an imagined criminal ecosystem. That contrast gives the investigation its visual identity. Paris is beautiful from a distance. Up close, Brian discovers the machinery underneath. And the deeper he goes, the less interested the movie becomes in allowing him to behave like a conventional investigator. He does not have the luxury of building relationships with suspects or waiting for legal procedures to unfold. His investigation is physical. Information must be extracted. Doors must be opened. People must be confronted. The city itself becomes something Brian has to penetrate. This is where the 96-hour clock becomes particularly effective. Without it, Brian's aggressive methods might feel unnecessarily extreme. With it, every obstacle feels urgent. The audience understands that the normal pace of investigation is useless against a crime designed around disappearance. Brian is therefore not simply moving through Paris. He is stripping time away from the people who took Kim. Every clue shortens their advantage. Every confrontation pushes him closer. Every delay becomes terrifying because we know what the clock means. The movie also uses Brian's former CIA identity as a shortcut to characterization. Instead of explaining every technique he knows, Taken allows his behavior to demonstrate his background. He reads people quickly. He anticipates movement. He knows how criminal networks operate. Most importantly, he knows that hesitation can be fatal. That knowledge makes him terrifying. But it also creates one of the film's central moral tensions. Brian is entering a world where conventional rules are almost useless, and he responds by abandoning them himself. He does not ask whether the information he needs can be obtained politely. He asks whether it can be obtained quickly. The difference between those two questions defines the entire second act. The beautiful city that once represented Kim's freedom has become Brian's hunting ground. He moves through it without sightseeing, without romance, without distraction. Paris is no longer a destination. It is a maze. And Brian is tearing the maze apart one piece at a time. The brilliance of this section is that Taken turns investigation into action, without needing to constantly escalate the scale. Brian does not require explosions every few minutes. The tension comes from watching an experienced man eliminate possibilities with frightening speed. He is not searching randomly. He is closing a net. And somewhere inside that sprawling city, the people who believed Kim was simply another victim are beginning to discover the terrible mistake they made. They did not just take a young woman. They activated her father. The investigation changes the moment Brian finds Amanda. Until now, the movie has allowed us to believe that time, skill, and determination might still be enough. Amanda's body destroys that possibility. Brian is no longer simply chasing Kim's kidnappers. He is confronting a system in which a girl can disappear, be exploited, and be discarded before anyone outside the operation even knows she existed. The discovery is devastating because Brian understands what it means. Amanda was traveling with Kim. She was exposed to the same people, the same network, and the same fate. Her death is therefore not only a tragedy, it is a prediction. Kim could be next. The 96-hour clock suddenly feels different. Earlier, it functioned as a thriller device, a number hanging over the investigation. Now it becomes a countdown towards something horrifying. Brian does not know exactly how much time remains, but he knows that the window is closing. And the movie refuses to let him process that emotionally for very long. He has to keep moving. That is one of Taken's defining characteristics. Whenever Brian reaches a moment that could become reflective, the story converts emotion into action. Grief becomes information. Fear becomes urgency. Anger becomes another tool. That transformation becomes even more disturbing when Brian reconnects with Jean-Claude. Jean-Claude is not a stranger. He is an old friend from Brian's intelligence career. Someone Brian once trusted and someone who represents the institutions Brian has now been forced to leave behind. Their history makes the revelation of Jean-Claude's corruption feel personal. The threat is no longer simply criminal. It has reached inside the system. Jean-Claude's involvement confirms that Brian cannot rely on normal law enforcement. The people who should be protecting victims may instead be protecting the network. For Brian, that realization removes the last reason to restrain himself. The dinner at Jean-Claude's house becomes the clearest expression of that moral collapse. When Jean-Claude refuses to cooperate, Brian shoots his wife in the arm. It is shocking because the film does not present it as an impulsive explosion. Brian makes a calculation. He knows where to apply pressure and he knows exactly why he is doing it. This is the point where Taken asks us to accept a deeply uncomfortable transformation. Brian's morality has become subordinate to his mission. And within the movie's emotional logic, they do. Jean-Claude gives him the information he needs. That progression is essential to the fantasy of Taken. The film is not merely saying that Brian is skilled. It is saying that ordinary rules are obstacles between him and his daughter. Once Brian accepts that idea, there is almost nothing left that he will not do. That leads directly to Marco. When Brian finally reaches the man whose voice he heard during the kidnapping, the confrontation feels inevitable. Marco is no longer an abstract threat coming through a telephone. He is physically present, trapped in the same world Brian has been tearing apart. The interrogation becomes torture. Electrical currents are used to force Marco to talk, pushing Brian's methods far beyond conventional heroism. The violence is extreme, but Taken presents it through Brian's certainty, rather than through moral debate. He wants information. Marco has it, therefore Brian will extract it. Taken makes revenge emotionally efficient. It gives the audience a clear target for anger, then allows Brian to express that anger without hesitation. There is no prolonged argument about whether Marco deserves mercy. The movie's emotional architecture has already answered the question. Marco's violence against innocent girls makes Brian's violence against Marco feel satisfying. But that satisfaction comes at a cost. The film is quietly transforming its hero into something frightening. Brian began as a father who wanted to protect his child. By this midpoint, he has become an instrument of punishment, willing to injure anyone standing between himself and Kim. The distinction between hero and threat is becoming thinner. And that is exactly why this section matters. Amanda's death establishes what Brian is fighting against. Jean-Claude's betrayal destroys his faith in institutions. The torture of Marco reveals what Brian is willing to become. Brian is moving through a world where terrible things have already happened, and he has decided that anyone responsible will pay. The clock is still running, but now Brian is running with it. The scene also exposes its central bargain with its audience. If the threat is monstrous enough, almost any response can feel necessary. Taken rarely pauses to challenge that bargain. Instead, it accelerates, allowing Brian's certainty to substitute for legal or moral procedure. That makes the midpoint thrilling, but it also makes the character unsettling. The final act takes Brian into the darkest version of the world he has been chasing. Until now, he has been moving through fragments. Names, addresses, dealers, corrupt officials, and men who know more than they want to admit. Now those fragments finally connect. Kim has not simply been kidnapped. She has been absorbed into a market where vulnerable young women are treated as products. The location is deliberately removed from the Paris tourists know. Beneath wealth, architecture, and polished surfaces is an underground auction where human beings are displayed to wealthy buyers. The contrast is horrifying because the room is not chaotic. It is organized, quiet, expensive. That calm is what makes the scene so disturbing. Brian enters the auction knowing he may be too late. He sees the women being presented one by one, reduced to numbers and prices. Then he recognizes Kim. For a moment, the entire movie collapses into one question. How much is his daughter worth to these people? Brian begins bidding. The sequence turns money into a weapon. He is not trying to win the auction for profit. He is using his willingness to pay as camouflage, forcing the buyers to reveal themselves while desperately trying to keep Kim within reach. The father who once worried about buying his daughter the right gift is now prepared to spend whatever it takes to get her back. But the rescue does not end with the auction. Kim is moved onto a luxury yacht on the Seine and taken shifts into its final physical phase. The setting is important. A vessel associated with wealth and leisure becomes a rather confined battlefield. There is nowhere for Brian to wander. Every corridor, staircase, doorway, and cabin becomes part of the fight. This is where the film's action philosophy becomes clearest. Brian does not fight like someone performing for an audience. He clears spaces systematically. He enters, identifies the threat, closes distance, attacks, and moves forward. Every object around him can become useful. Walls, furniture, narrow passages, doors, and the architecture itself. That efficiency makes the violence feel almost mechanical. There is very little wasted movement. Brian does not chase style. He chases results. The closer he gets to Kim, the more the movie strips away everything except physical survival. The man who once seemed awkward and emotionally lost has become completely focused. His entire personality has narrowed around one purpose: find her, protect her, bring her home. That purpose eventually carries him to the final confrontation with the Sheik, the powerful man connected to the trafficking operation. Yet Taken refuses to turn the final encounter into an elaborate duel. There is no grand speech, no extended battle, and no spectacular final set piece designed to make the villain memorable. The confrontation is short, abrupt, almost anticlimactic. And that is precisely the point. Brian does not need a theatrical victory. He needs the threat removed. The Sheik is killed with the same ruthless practicality that has defined Brian's journey. The movie has spent hours building toward revenge, but when the moment arrives, it is over almost immediately. There is no celebration, only completion. Then Taken does something quiet. Brian returns to Los Angeles with Kim. The violence is finished, but the emotional story is not. At the beginning of the film, Brian was desperate to reconnect with his daughter. He brought her an oversized karaoke machine because he believed he could buy his way back into her world. He was anxious, awkward, and aware that Kim's life was moving forward without him. Now he has saved her. And yet the movie does not pretend that the kidnapping magically repaired everything. Kim sees him differently because she has witnessed what he can do. Brian has also discovered that his old skills, the very abilities that made him effective, are inseparable from the darkness he carries. The reunion is warm, but not entirely uncomplicated. He has recovered his daughter, but he has not escaped himself. That is the quiet irony of Taken's ending. Brian succeeds because he becomes the man he had been trying to leave behind. His family can welcome him back. His daughter can smile. Life can begin again. But Brian remains defined by violence. And that is why the ending feels more melancholy than triumphant. The movie gives him what he wanted, but it does not give him innocence back. He saved Kim. He proved that he could still protect the people he loved. Yet the journey has revealed something darker. Brian's greatest strength and greatest weakness are the same thing. When the people he loves are threatened, he is capable of becoming almost anything. Taken closes not with the roar of another explosion, but with the possibility of ordinary life returning. For Brian Mills, however, ordinary life was never really the opposite of violence. It was simply the life he kept trying to get back to. Brian Mills is compelling because Taken does not begin with a hero who has everything. It begins with a man who has already lost the life he was supposed to protect. He is the broken patriarch. A father who spent years serving his country, only to discover that the mission continued while his family moved on without him. His deepest wound is guilt. Brian knows he missed Kim's childhood. While he was working, traveling, and dealing with threats that never entered his daughter's world, Kim was growing up. Retirement gives him time, but time cannot restore those lost years. Brian wants to be present, but he does not know how to be ordinary. He buys gifts, asks too many questions, and tries to compensate for absence through protection. He is trying to repair intimacy through control. Kim does not experience that as love. She experiences it as pressure. She wants independence because independence is part of growing up. Brian sees independence as exposure to danger. Their conflict is therefore between two definitions of safety. Brian believes safety means eliminating uncertainty. Kim believes safety means being trusted despite it. The kidnapping makes Brian's worldview suddenly correct. Before Kim is taken, Brian is a passive observer in his family's life. He watches Kim become increasingly independent. He is technically free but emotionally powerless. Then the phone rings. Everything changes because the crisis gives Brian something he understands: a mission. Brian does not become powerful because the kidnapping creates abilities he never possessed. It gives him permission to use abilities he has spent years suppressing. The confusion of family life disappears. There is no longer a question about what he should do or where he belongs. His daughter has been taken. Find her. For years, Brian's professional value came from being useful in dangerous situations. Parenting requires patience and compromise. Intelligence work rewards anticipation, decisiveness, and control. When Kim disappears, the old Brian returns because the old world has returned. The tragedy is that he is exceptionally good at it. He does not freeze. He gathers information, identifies patterns, locates contacts, and moves toward the next objective. His emotions are not absent, but they are subordinated to action. That is what makes him frightening. Brian's training has taught him to compartmentalize. Fear becomes information. Anger becomes energy. Grief becomes motivation. A normal person might see another human being and consider their feelings or circumstances. Brian increasingly sees obstacles, sources, threats, and targets. He shows extraordinary empathy toward Kim because Kim is his daughter. But that empathy does not automatically extend to everyone caught inside the trafficking network. Amanda's death matters because it reveals what might happen to Kim. The other victims matter, but the emotional center remains singular. Kim. That narrowness is morally troubling, and it is also dramatically useful. Taken builds its fantasy around hyper-focused paternal instinct. Brian does not need to save the world. He needs to save one person. The smaller the objective becomes, the more extreme his methods can feel justified within the story. This creates a fascinating contradiction. Brian is selfless because he is willing to risk everything for his daughter. Brian is selfish because almost everything he does is organized around her. He does not become a universal protector. He becomes an extremely dangerous father with a personal reason to act. His morality is therefore intimate rather than universal. And the movie rarely asks him to confront that limitation. Instead, it turns his obsession into momentum. His lack of restraint feels emotionally understandable, because the villains have committed an act so personally horrifying. But understandable is not the same as healthy. The deeper irony is that Brian's greatest failure as a father is connected to the same traits that make him such an effective rescuer. His emotional distance helped him survive dangerous work, but it also made family intimacy difficult. When the kidnapping happens, those flaws temporarily become strengths. The father who could not communicate with his daughter suddenly knows exactly what to do. That is why Brian Mills works as the broken patriarch. He is not simply a retired operative looking for one last mission. He is a man whose identity has been severed from the role he understands best. The kidnapping reconnects those two halves, but at a terrible cost. He gets to become useful again. He gets to become necessary. He gets to save his daughter. But Taken leaves an uncomfortable question beneath the fantasy. If Brian only feels fully alive when someone he loves is in danger, what happens when the danger is gone? The film does not answer it, and that silence makes him more interesting than the fantasy suggests. The villains of Taken are deliberately different from Brian Mills. Brian is specific. We know his history, his regrets, his daughter, and the emotional wound driving him forward. The people he fights are often defined almost entirely by what they do. They are less individual characters than pieces of a criminal ecosystem. That is particularly clear with Marco and the Albanian trafficking network. The film presents them as organized, predatory, and industrial. Their evil is not portrayed as a personal grudge or isolated act of violence. It is a business. Young women are identified, kidnapped, drugged, transported, sold, and exploited through a system designed to turn human vulnerability into profit. That makes Marco frightening, but it also makes him dramatically simple. He does not need a complicated motivation. Greed and brutality are enough. The absence of psychological depth is intentional, because Taken wants the audience to experience the trafficking network as an almost mechanical force. Brian enters a world where individuals can disappear into an organization, and the organization itself becomes the monster. Marco is one face of that monster. Jean-Claude represents something more complicated. Unlike Marco, Jean-Claude begins from a relationship of trust. He is connected to Brian's former professional world and understands the institutions that are supposed to protect people. His corruption therefore represents a different kind of betrayal. He has not become monstrous in the same way. He has compromised. That distinction matters. Brian and Jean-Claude are two men who came from a similar professional environment, but made different choices. Brian is rigid, obsessive, and unwilling to compromise when he believes something matters. Jean-Claude has adapted to comfort and convenience. His corruption suggests that the system does not always collapse because everyone inside it is evil. Sometimes it collapses because ordinary people decide that looking away is easier. That makes Jean-Claude an effective thematic foil. Brian sacrifices comfort for purpose. Jean-Claude sacrifices principle for comfort. One man has lost his family but refuses to lose his code. The other appears to have maintained a comfortable life while allowing that code to erode. Taken therefore creates a moral universe where compromise is dangerous. The further Brian travels into the criminal network, the more the movie separates people into categories. There are predators, collaborators, victims, and Brian himself. This becomes especially apparent with the wealthy buyers. The trafficking operation is not presented as something sustained only by street-level criminals. Wealthy customers create demand. Money gives the exploitation a polished surface. The underground auction is disturbing precisely because the people purchasing women are not presented as chaotic criminals. They are wealthy enough to treat human beings as luxury commodities. The movie therefore builds an entire hierarchy of corruption. At the bottom are the people doing the physical work. Above them are organizers and corrupt officials. At the top are wealthy buyers who can purchase access to vulnerable people. Brian moves through every level. But there is another layer to the story, and it is much more uncomfortable. Taken constructs a fantasy of foreign danger that depends heavily on contrast. Brian begins in an American suburban environment, associated with family, comfort, and relative safety. Kim travels to Europe, and the moment she enters that unfamiliar world, the movie transforms it into a landscape of hidden predators. Paris becomes less a real city than a symbolic foreign underworld. The tourist attractions disappear. The romantic image disappears. What remains is trafficking, corruption, drugs, criminal networks, and people who seem ready to exploit innocence. That framing creates a powerful but deeply simplistic opposition. Safe American father versus dangerous foreign world. Brian crosses the ocean to retrieve his daughter, and his mission becomes a kind of violent purification. He enters the corrupt environment, identifies the people responsible, and destroys them one by one. That is where the film's thriller fantasy overlaps with xenophobic storytelling. Taken does not merely depict individual criminals. It can encourage the impression that danger is embedded within foreign spaces and foreign communities, while American family life represents the moral center. The movie's geography becomes moral geography. Home is safe. Away is dangerous. The American father understands the threat. The foreign environment hides it. That is an emotionally efficient structure, but reality is much more complicated. Human trafficking is a global crime involving networks, exploitation, poverty, demand, corruption, and victims from many different backgrounds. It cannot honestly be reduced to one nationality or one foreign underworld. Taken is not trying to provide that complexity. It is constructing a revenge fantasy. And revenge fantasies need clarity. The villains must be recognizable enough that the audience never doubts who deserves to be stopped. Their lack of depth is therefore part of the mechanism. The less we understand their inner lives, the easier it becomes to experience Brian's violence as satisfying. That is why the film's antagonist psychology is ultimately less about psychology than morality. Brian represents uncompromising action. Jean-Claude represents compromised institutions. The trafficking network represents organized depravity. The wealthy buyers represent corruption hidden behind privilege. Together, they create a world designed to justify Brian's transformation from anxious father into lethal force. And that is the uncomfortable brilliance of the construction. The movie makes Brian's worldview feel correct, because it builds a world specifically engineered to prove him right. His paranoia becomes foresight. His violence becomes protection. His isolation becomes independence. His refusal to compromise becomes strength. But once we step outside the fantasy, another interpretation emerges. Brian does not simply enter a world of monsters. The movie has created a world where monsters are almost all the audience is allowed to see. That is why Taken can be both an enormously effective action thriller and a deeply problematic cultural fantasy at the same time. Taken keeps its supporting cast relatively simple, but that simplicity is part of the design. Most of the characters surrounding Brian exist to illuminate a different part of his personality. They are not competing for the story's attention. They are mirrors, pressure points, and reminders of what Brian has lost. Lenore is the first of those mirrors. Played by Famke Janssen, Lenore initially treats Brian with a mixture of impatience and disdain. She sees the same qualities the audience is encouraged to notice. He is overprotective, socially awkward, and seemingly incapable of accepting that his daughter is growing up. From her perspective, Brian is living in the past. He missed Kim's childhood, and now he wants to compensate by controlling her present. His concern feels less like wisdom and more like interference. That makes Lenore important because she gives the audience permission to question Brian before the movie proves him right. For the first part of Taken, Brian can look almost ridiculous. He is the divorced father who worries too much, asks too many questions, and arrives with an oversized karaoke machine because he desperately wants his daughter's approval. Lenore represents the domestic world Brian cannot quite navigate. She has moved forward. Brian has not. Her new relationship with Stuart reinforces that contrast. Stuart represents financial security and social confidence, while Brian represents a more uncertain kind of masculinity. He may possess extraordinary professional skills, but those skills have little value during an ordinary family dinner. The irony is that the qualities Lenore finds frustrating are exactly the qualities that will become necessary once Kim disappears. His vigilance becomes valuable. His suspicion becomes accurate. His inability to relax becomes survival instinct. Taken therefore transforms Brian's apparent weakness into strength without completely erasing the weakness itself. Then there is Kim. Maggie Grace's performance is deliberately positioned around innocence. Kim is young, excited about Paris, fascinated by horses, and eager to experience a world beyond the limits her father keeps trying to impose. Her naivety is not presented as malicious rebellion. She simply does not understand the danger Brian sees. That distinction matters because the film needs the kidnapping to feel like the destruction of innocence. Kim believes the world is larger than her father allows her to believe. Brian believes the world is more dangerous than she understands. The kidnapping turns their disagreement into proof of both perspectives. Kim's interests also help define what Brian is trying to preserve. Her fascination with horses and her excitement about travel make her feel like a young woman standing at the beginning of her life. The more innocent she appears, the more horrifying the trafficking network becomes. The film intentionally makes the contrast extreme. Paris represents freedom to Kim. For Brian, it becomes a battlefield. Her youthful optimism also creates a generational divide. Brian comes from a world of intelligence operations, hidden threats, and professional suspicion. Kim comes from a generation increasingly comfortable with communication, travel, and trusting strangers through social connections. Brian sees a trap. Kim sees an opportunity. Neither can fully understand the other's worldview until the kidnapping forces them together through that phone call. In that sense, Kim's absence becomes almost as important as her presence. After she is taken, she is no longer simply a character moving through the story. She becomes the objective around which every decision revolves. The supporting cast therefore becomes increasingly functional. Brian's former CIA colleagues, including Sam, serve another important purpose. They validate him. Before the kidnapping, the audience has very little reason to believe Brian's paranoia is justified. He looks like an anxious father who has spent too long imagining worst-case scenarios. His old colleagues change that interpretation. They know what Brian can do. They understand the world he came from. When they respond to the kidnapping and the 96-hour window, they effectively tell the audience that Brian's fears are not completely irrational. He has professional knowledge that his family does not possess. This is a crucial storytelling shortcut. Taken does not need to spend 20 minutes showing Brian's entire career as a CIA operative. His colleagues establish his credibility through dialogue and reactions. They function almost like witnesses to a version of Brian that his family has never seen. To Lenore, he is an overbearing ex-husband. To Kim, he is an embarrassing father who worries too much. To Sam and the other former colleagues, he is someone extremely capable who understands exactly what kind of situation he is facing. Those three perspectives create the character. Brian is not simply one thing. He is simultaneously a failed domestic figure, a loving father, and a highly trained professional. The kidnapping forces those identities into conflict. The domestic Brian wants to save Kim because he loves her. The professional Brian knows how to save her because he has been trained for situations like this. And the broken Brian desperately needs the mission because it gives him a chance to become necessary to his daughter again. That is why the supporting characters matter even when they disappear from the screen. Lenore establishes what Brian has failed to become. Kim establishes what he is desperate to protect. His former colleagues establish what he has always been capable of. Together, they create the emotional framework around the action hero. Without them, Brian would simply be an exceptionally competent man hunting criminals. With them, he becomes something more specific. A father whose professional identity has been buried beneath years of domestic frustration, suddenly awakened by the worst possible event. And that is what makes the supporting cast so effective. They do not distract from Brian's transformation. They explain it. At its simplest, Taken is a story about a father searching for his daughter. But underneath the pursuit is a darker argument about safety, responsibility, and what happens when the systems designed to protect ordinary people fail. The film's most powerful theme is the primal father. Brian begins inside modern civilization. There are laws, police departments, passports, borders, intelligence agencies, and international procedures. In theory, those systems should protect Kim. But once she disappears, they become obstacles or failures. Brian therefore returns to something much older than institutions: personal protection through force. Taken imagines a world where civilization can disappear almost instantly. Remove the safety of home, family, and familiar surroundings, and suddenly the rules that structure ordinary life seem fragile. Brian cannot simply trust a system to bring Kim back. He has to become the system himself. That is why his violence is framed as necessary rather than merely destructive. The movie strips away the usual moral complications of vigilantism. Brian does not spend much time wondering whether he should cross the line. The story keeps presenting him with circumstances that make crossing the line feel inevitable. Someone has taken his daughter. Someone must answer for it. The result is a primal fantasy of fatherhood. Brian's identity becomes almost completely reduced to protection. He is no longer concerned with being a good husband, a successful professional, or a socially acceptable father. He is simply trying to retrieve his child. That connects directly to the film's second major theme: the illusion of safety. Kim begins the story surrounded by comfort. She comes from a wealthy environment where travel feels exciting rather than threatening. Paris is presented to her as an adventure, a place where she can experience independence. But Taken deliberately shatters that illusion. The moment she leaves the familiar environment, the rules appear to change. The message is deliberately unsettling. Danger does not always look dangerous. It can appear as a friendly stranger at an airport. It can enter through a conversation, a ride, or an invitation. The world that looks safe from a distance can conceal predatory systems underneath. This is part of what makes the kidnapping so effective emotionally. Kim does not enter a visibly dangerous neighborhood. She enters a beautiful city. The horror comes from the discovery that beauty offers no guarantee of safety. Taken turns travel into a metaphor for leaving the protective bubble of childhood. Kim wants independence because she believes she is ready for the world. Brian believes the world is waiting for an opportunity to prove otherwise. The kidnapping becomes the movie's extreme answer to their disagreement. But the film's darkest theme may be its distrust of institutions. Police cannot save Kim. International borders cannot protect her. Official procedures cannot move quickly enough. Even Brian's former professional network can provide information without actually solving the problem. Worse, people inside the system are compromised. Jean-Claude's corruption destroys the idea that authority automatically equals protection. Taken therefore creates a world where institutional competence is unreliable, while individual competence is decisive. Brian succeeds because he knows what to do. He does not wait for permission. He does not wait for bureaucracy. He does not trust the system to move at the speed of the threat. He acts. That is enormously satisfying as an action fantasy because it reduces a complicated world to a simple equation. When institutions fail, the capable individual must take responsibility. But it is also one of the film's most revealing ideological assumptions. Taken is not really arguing that society has no systems. It is arguing that systems are too slow when something truly matters. And when the stakes become personal, the movie suggests that morality itself can become more immediate and primitive. Brian does not need a courtroom. He needs Kim. That is why the film remains emotionally powerful, even when its worldview becomes exaggerated. It touches a deeply recognizable fear: the belief that the people we love can become vulnerable in an instant, and that the protection surrounding us may not be enough when disaster arrives. The fantasy is that, in that moment, someone will be capable of doing what needs to be done. Taken simply makes that someone a father, and then gives him the skills to turn fear into action. Taken tells its story through more than dialogue and action. Pierre Morel's visual language quietly separates the two worlds Brian occupies: the domestic life he wants and the violent professional world he understands. The contrast is not truly between America and Paris. It is between illusion and reality, comfort and exposure, the father Brian wishes he could be and the operative he actually knows how to become. Los Angeles is presented with a warmer, softer visual atmosphere. The light feels inviting, the colors are comparatively rich, and the spaces around Brian's family suggest comfort. Yet there is something artificial about that warmth. The domestic world looks safe because it has been insulated from the threats Brian spent his career confronting. Its brightness therefore becomes almost ironic. This is the world Brian wants to protect, but it is also the world in which he feels least capable of belonging. Paris gradually strips that warmth away. The imagery becomes colder, harder and more desaturated, with blue-gray tones that make streets, interiors and industrial spaces feel metallic. The city is no longer romantic. It becomes an extension of Brian's mental state. Tense, exhausted, suspicious, and increasingly hostile. The deeper he travels into the criminal network, the further the film moves from postcard beauty towards steel, concrete, darkness, and artificial light. The most important visual motif, however, may be the telephone. The phone begins as an ordinary object connecting a father and daughter across distance. Then the kidnapping transforms it into something terrifying. Kim's voice comes through the receiver, and suddenly the device becomes the only physical link Brian has to her. He cannot reach through it. He cannot protect her directly. He can only listen. That makes the phone a lifeline and a weapon at the same time. It carries information, but it also carries fear. The sound of a ringing phone can now mean that Kim is alive, that Brian has another clue, or that another piece of his old life is collapsing. The famous conversation turns a small electronic connection into the emotional center of the movie. Then there is glass. Taken repeatedly places Brian around windows, reflections, and transparent barriers, visualizing a man who can see the world without fully belonging inside it. Glass separates him from other people, just as his professional history separates him from ordinary domestic life. When that glass is dirty, cracked, or fragmented, the image becomes an extension of his fractured identity. Mirrors create a similar effect. A reflection can make Brian appear divided. Father on one side, operative on the other. He is constantly looking at versions of himself that do not comfortably fit together. The visual fragmentation mirrors the moral fragmentation. The man who wanted to reconnect with his daughter is becoming the man capable of destroying anyone who stands between them. The symbolism therefore remains remarkably consistent. Warmth represents the life Brian wants. Coldness represents the world he understands. The phone represents the fragile connection between those worlds. Glass and mirrors represent the fractured man caught between them. By the end, Brian has crossed the distance physically, but the visual language suggests that something inside him has not crossed back. He can return to Los Angeles, but he cannot simply erase what Paris required him to become. Taken's imagery works because it rarely announces these ideas. The colors, objects, reflections, and spaces quietly tell the same story as the screenplay. Brian begins by looking into a life he cannot quite enter, and ends by discovering that the violent identity he thought he had left behind is still waiting on the other side of the glass. Taken works on the surface as a straightforward rescue thriller, but beneath its efficient action is a worldview shaped by a much larger cultural anxiety. The film arrives in the shadow of 9/11, during an era when American popular culture was deeply preoccupied with invisible enemies, vulnerable borders, and the possibility that danger could enter ordinary life without warning. Kim's kidnapping transforms that anxiety into a family story. The threat is foreign, organized, and difficult for conventional institutions to contain. Brian cannot simply call the police and wait. He needs to enter the dangerous world himself, locate the enemy, and use whatever force is necessary to bring his daughter home. That becomes a distinctly conservative power fantasy. Brian represents the protector who does not need permission. Diplomacy, jurisdiction, and procedure become inconveniences when the stakes are personal. The fantasy is that somewhere inside the system exists a man who understands the threat clearly enough to ignore its limitations. The film's appeal comes partly from that certainty. Brian knows who the wolves are. He knows what must be done, and he does not hesitate. The globalization anxiety is equally important. Kim's journey to Paris is supposed to represent a world that has become smaller and more connected. Travel is easier. Communication is faster. Young people can cross borders and experience cultures their parents could only imagine. But Taken reverses that optimism. The interconnected world becomes an interconnected criminal network. Airports, phones, passports, and international travel no longer represent freedom. They become mechanisms through which vulnerable people can be moved and exploited. The movie therefore reflects a fear that globalization has made danger more mobile. There is also a darker sexual subtext surrounding Kim and Amanda. Taken places enormous emphasis on Kim's innocence. She is presented as inexperienced, excited, and still protected by her father's concern. Amanda, by contrast, is portrayed as more adventurous and more willing to embrace the nightlife of Paris. Her fate is devastating, but the film's construction can also feel moralistic. The contrast risks implying that sexual openness, drinking, partying, and youthful independence make young women more deserving of danger or more responsible for exposing themselves to it. The movie never needs to say that directly. The structure communicates the anxiety. Kim's innocence becomes something Brian must preserve, while Amanda's behavior is associated with vulnerability and destruction. That creates an almost puritanical warning beneath the thriller. Leave the protective environment, enter an unfamiliar world, and the consequences may be catastrophic. That reading is uncomfortable because the actual victims of trafficking are not responsible for the crimes committed against them. Yet Taken's fantasy depends on making innocence feel fragile and contamination feel possible. This leads naturally to the film's most recognizable archetype, the sheepdog. The metaphor divides the world into three groups. There are the sheep, ordinary people who want to live peacefully. There are the wolves, predators who exploit weakness. And then there are the sheepdogs, people who possess the capacity for violence and accept the burden of using it to protect everyone else. Brian is the ultimate cinematic sheepdog. He is uncomfortable in ordinary domestic life because his skills have little purpose there. But when the wolves appear, suddenly his isolation becomes an advantage. He knows how predators think because he has spent his career studying them. The fantasy depends on a contradiction. The sheepdog must be capable of becoming frightening enough to defeat the wolves. That means Brian cannot remain completely innocent himself. He has to understand violence. He has to use violence. He has to become willing to cross boundaries that ordinary people cannot cross. Taken presents that transformation as necessary. The audience is encouraged to believe that a world this dangerous requires someone like Brian. His violence is not celebrated simply because violence is enjoyable. It is framed as the unpleasant responsibility of the protector. That is why the film's power extends beyond its kidnapping plot. It speaks to a cultural desire for certainty in an uncertain world. When institutions seem slow, enemies seem invisible, and borders seem increasingly porous, Taken offers an extraordinarily simple answer. Find the person who knows what to do and let him act. Brian becomes that person. He is father, soldier, investigator, and executioner compressed into one figure. And that compression is both the movie's greatest fantasy and its most revealing limitation. Taken asks us to imagine a world where complicated problems can be solved by individual strength. It feels comforting because the alternative is much more frightening. Accepting that sometimes the world cannot be completely controlled no matter how skilled, powerful, or determined the protector may be. Taken does not have the kind of visual effects audiences normally associate with a modern action blockbuster. There are no digital monsters, collapsing cities, armies of computer-generated characters, or impossible worlds waiting to be rendered. Its spectacle comes from something much more difficult to fake: physical movement. The movie's real visual effects system is editing. Editor Frederick Thorevel gives Taken its distinctive sense of velocity by cutting action into short, aggressive fragments. A punch does not necessarily need to be shown from beginning to end. The audience sees the preparation, the impact, the reaction, and then Brian is already moving toward the next threat. That rhythm creates what could almost be called the morale cut. The technique is not simply fast editing for the sake of speed. The cuts are synchronized with Brian's decisions. Each shot communicates another stage of the process. Identify, move, strike, eliminate, continue. The audience therefore experiences violence from Brian's perspective, rather than watching it like choreography performed for entertainment. That distinction matters. A conventional action scene often wants the audience to admire the fighter. Taken wants the audience to understand the fighter. Brian does not perform. He solves. The editing supports that characterization by refusing to linger on movements that do not matter. A fight becomes a sequence of tactical decisions compressed into seconds. The result is intense without requiring the extreme visual fragmentation that had become common in action cinema during the late 2000s. There is still chaos, but it is controlled chaos. That control also depends on Liam Neeson's physical preparation. Neeson trained in close-quarters combat techniques associated with systems such as Krav Maga and Sayat Kali, emphasizing practical movement, rapid reactions, disarms, and weapon awareness, rather than elaborate martial arts showmanship. The choreography is designed around efficiency. Brian does not need to execute a spectacular kick across a room. He needs to close distance, break balance, control the opponent, move on. That makes the violence feel appropriate for the character. Brian is not a tournament fighter. He is a trained operative whose objective is to survive and complete the mission. His age actually becomes part of the visual language. A younger action star can rely on speed and athletic spectacle. Neeson relies more heavily on positioning, timing, and force. His body appears heavier, which gives his attacks a sense of consequence. When he hits someone, the movement feels like it has weight. This is where Taken sharply contrasts with the increasingly digital action cinema surrounding it. By the late 2000s, audiences were becoming accustomed to scenes where human bodies could be manipulated, duplicated, enhanced, or replaced through computer-generated effects. Digital doubles could perform movements no actor could realistically execute, while rapid editing could hide the transition between practical performance and visual effects. Taken largely moves in the opposite direction. Its action feels grounded because the environment remains physical. People hit walls. Furniture gets in the way. Bodies occupy space. Rooms have limitations. The fights therefore become spatial problems rather than abstract displays of athleticism. Brian's environment matters because he uses it. A doorway becomes a choke point. A narrow corridor limits the opponent's movement. A wall becomes leverage. A piece of furniture becomes an obstacle. The world is not simply a backdrop behind the action. It is part of the choreography. That physicality gives the film an almost tactile quality. Even when the editing becomes rapid, the audience can sense that the violence is happening inside real spaces occupied by real bodies. The result is a strange paradox. Taken looks fast because it is edited aggressively, yet it feels grounded because the underlying movement is physical. That combination is crucial. Too much speed can make action incomprehensible. Too much realism can make it feel slow. Taken sits between those extremes by allowing the cuts to create velocity, while the performers create weight. And because Brian's fighting style is so closely connected to his character, the action scenes become a form of storytelling. When Brian attacks efficiently, we learn that he has stopped thinking like an ordinary father. When he improvises with his surroundings, we see the professional returning. When he refuses to stop, we understand how completely the mission has consumed him. The editing and stunt work therefore accomplish more than making the movie exciting. They turn physical action into character psychology. Brian's body becomes an extension of his mind, direct, economical, impatient, and brutally focused.